and welcome to a brand new episode of Melt. I'm Ritvika Gupta, and on the show today we'll be speaking to Laskhmanan Narayan. Now he's the CEO and co-founder of Unmetric, and he's going to be talking to us about the significance of social and the importance of social media benchmarking. Anant Rangaswami, editor of Melt, is here with me today. Hi Anant.
Hello.
Anant, here on Melt, we have discussed the importance of data, and the ability to make it actionable. And today we'll be talking about the platforms and tools that sort of, help analyze information on social media. So why don't you begin by telling us what Unmetric is all about and a little bit on your conversation with Lux.
Unmetric is a company that measures social media impact, and they're focused to only brands. They don't measure human beings and their impact. So, for example, Unmetric will not be able to tell us, what Priyanka Chopra does or what, maybe Anand Mahindra does, but they can tell us what, say, a Burger King is doing better than a McDonald's, or how a Volvo is doing better than a Mercedes-Benz or whatever. So what they do is to try and benchmark brands versus each other by measuring all the conversations happening on social media across all platforms. So whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever, they track every single conversation about brands and then give you a sort of brand score. They tell you what is being done well, what is being done badly, and so on.
Social media marketing has been around for a while now, yet marketers are finding it harder and harder to crack social media. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I think you gave the answer yourself, in the sense it's relatively new. While you say it's been happening for some time, it's been happening ever since social media was born.
Right.
And we tend to forget that, say, a Twitter is just 12 years old or whatever, 10 years old, I don't even know. That's all it is. So marketers see this new medium, first they wonder whether they should get onto it. Then when they get onto it, they try to understand how to get onto it, what to do, what not to do. And then you have the metrics, like first it was, whether it was Facebook or Twitter or whatever, it was about likes, which is a crazy metric. And then you got the bots came on board. So marketers have to look beyond that, and they look at quality engagement. For example, Unmetric tries to understand sentiment of conversations, not just volume of conversations.
Yeah.
So all these things are new metrics, and marketers want to navigate the medium all over again.
Right.
And tools such as what Unmetric gives you helps you understand the world better.
Right. So what did Lux say? Should social media still be a huge part of a marketer's priority list?
No, he doesn't say it should be a huge part, but he certainly says it should be a part. And social media conversation is something brands can't ignore. Because if they're not in the conversation will happen anyway.
Right.
So that's the important thing. You have to be in the conversation because there is a conversation. Simple as that.
Right. Lux also mentioned that Unmetric also gives insights to competition. How important do you think it is for brands to be super aware of what others are doing?
Well, whether it's in the analog world where brands need to understand what other brands are doing, say on TV or print or outdoor, so do brands need to understand what other competitors are doing on any social media platform. Well, you have to.
Right. Well, it's a given that, any brand would want to know their social media insights and how customers are responding to them. But probably, knowing about competition will sort of give them an edge. So let's find out more about social media benchmarking. Let's get ready to melt with Laskhmanan Narayan.
Lux, hello.
Hey Anand.
So it's now 8 years since you launched Unmetric.
Yes, it is.
On the surface of it, it's 8 years, you're doing the same thing. You're measuring the impact of social media. That's all you're doing. That's not changed. You did it in 2012, you're doing it in 2019. What has changed? What are you measuring which is different? What are the clients asking you which is different?
It's interesting. I mean, first of all, when you put it in perspective like that, it has indeed been 8 years of doing more or less the same thing from an input level.
Right.
So our input continues to be the exhaust of brands on different social networks.
Right.
And that hasn't changed fundamentally, right? So it's still the same data set. The questions that clients are asking, so clients, again, I would put a bit of granularity into that.
Right.
Earlier and even now, our core client was and is a brand or an agency who is thinking about social for its own sake, because it's an extrapolation of the brand. It is the brand's presence on different networks, and they want to ensure that they're doing what is better than what is par for the course. So those definitions of what they were looking at has evolved over time.
Right.
So 8 years ago, the most fundamental questions were simply, is my community bigger than somebody else's?
Right.
Is my community growing faster than somebody else's? Right. And that was par for the course. And then that became table stakes. And then it evolved into, is my content resonating better with people than others is? That was simply in terms of likes. After that, it became, is my content generating more conversation than others' content is, or than my previous content did? So then it was about commentary. And then it was, is my content being amplified more than others because you also want the reach that the medium affords? So all of that has been evolving in terms of what people are looking at, starting with community and on to engagement and on to the different drivers of that engagement, the flavors of that engagement. If people are commenting, it's not necessarily good. It could be bad things. So you want to ensure that the commentary is in the direction that you'd like it to be.
Right.
So we're seeing that evolution from the core audience. The other interesting thing we're seeing is new audiences altogether for this kind of data, because this is data that is about brands, and our natural assumption is that it's relevant to brands, which it is, but it's also relevant to a lot of other audiences. And
Before we get to the other audiences, we'll stick to the brands.
Okay.
Right. So let's say while you've been in the same business ostensibly for 8 years, things have changed, as in the volumes of conversations have changed. Number of brands which are active on social media has changed. Number of social media options has increased. You just had a Twitter and a Facebook to begin with, you know, and now suddenly you've got, say, Instagram, you've got Snapchat, you've got a lot of things.
Right.
So how does that increase your complexity and the complexity for the, how do you reduce the complexity for the user, for your user, which is the brand itself?
Yeah. And that's absolutely true. We started off with just 2 networks. We started off with Facebook and Twitter, and now it's half a dozen networks. But the beautiful thing is, each network has its own idiosyncrasy, which is defined by the nature of the network itself. And while earlier each network was simply seen as another optional outpost for a brand, brands have evolved beyond that, where each network has a role. Right? Earlier it was anything you have to say, put it out on Facebook, put it out on Twitter. When Instagram became popular, put it out on Instagram. But we're increasingly seeing a granularity in terms of what brands put on each network and what their focus is on each network. For starters, Twitter is still the truly non-symmetric medium at this point. And just to explain that a bit, on Facebook, if I want to be your friend, you need to accept that you're okay with being my friend, because it's a symmetrical relationship. Unless I just want to follow you, in which case that's a different option. Twitter was always asymmetrical to start with, where anyone's content out there is there for the whole world to absorb, and therefore that lends itself to react to. Right? You would hear or see content from somebody you had no clue existed, and thereafter might decide to follow them or see content from them. And that nature of Twitter content being amplified beyond people who have already chosen to consume the content allows for a lot more amplification. Instagram is by definition a visual medium, lends itself to certain categories. Brands have taken a bit of a different approach in terms of how they approach it. So that sophistication is increasing day by day. There's also granularity in terms of functions that the media afford. So Twitter, very soon, we saw that a couple of years after we started the platform, more and more brands wanted to use Twitter to benchmark and calibrate their customer service.
Right.
The average airline in the United States gets about 3,000 queries in a given week on Twitter. The joke is, if you want a faster response from an airline, tweet to them. If you call them up on a call center, you're probably going to be on hold for about 15 minutes.
Right.
And suddenly now Twitter is also seen, therefore, as a customer service medium. And what you want to calibrate beyond engagement is how fast are you responding? What percentage of queries directed to you are you responding to? Are you apologizing more than what is par for the course? So each of these new functions then throws open a whole bunch of new parameters that you want to benchmark, calibrate, look at, and improve.
Now we come to use cases beyond brands, which you started talking about and which I interrupted you on. For example, you told me about this hedge fund, which will remain unnamed, but which is using your services. Why do they use their services? In what context do they use your services?
So this was a new world to us about a year ago. I was talking at an event in Colorado about big data and the kind of data we have. And after that, someone comes and has a conversation, and he told me he's from a hedge fund. And then he explained that a lot of what they're looking at nowadays is everyone's looking at that information arbitrage, that advantage, that edge that someone else doesn't have. And apparently alternative data is a big thing in the whole hedge fund industry, where starting from the number of cars in a parking lot, they're looking at any other data set that can give them an advantage over others in terms of seeing which way a company is moving.
Just expand
the
cars in a parking lot.
alternative data for hedge funds.
Right.
So in the cars in the parking lot, you have satellite imagery that tells you how many cars are in different parking lots.
Right.
That gives you sort of a temperature check on the amount of business that a retail chain is doing.
Right. Right.
In a similar way, the number of conversations happening around the brand anchors for a publicly listed company is interesting data.
Right.
When something big happens, good or bad, the first place people take to vent their joy or frustration is often the wall of a brand on Facebook or tweet at the brand. And you see a very discernible, statistically definable surge in the volumes of comments or tweets at a brand or a whole bunch of conversations that consumers are having with the brand. Index that by ticker symbol, and that's pretty interesting then, because you have on a company basis the volume of conversation happening in social media around that company.
Right.
So that's one use case that we found interesting. There's another use case, sports teams. So we have a couple of sports teams we work with, the Chicago Bulls and the Blackhawks, and these people have sold their in-stadium advertising space for the entire year. But guess what? They have infinite inventory on social.
Right.
So suddenly it's become a revenue generator where they would go to a local brand and tell them, we'll run a campaign for you, 3 tweets, 1 Instagram post, and 1 Facebook post. We will co-create it because we don't want to move far away from what our brand stands for.
And neither does the brand.
Neither does the brand.
Sure.
And they would do, and suddenly that's a campaign that they would charge sponsorship dollars for on perishable inventory that the brand owns. And the big thing that the sports team brings is the fact that they have a bunch of rabid fans who love them and often geographically defined. So we've started using our data to help these teams prospect for new brands who might be a fit, get a sense of what a brand stands for, calibrate against other sports teams. So increasingly, we're finding that the data can be used by other people beyond the core audience of brands and agencies. So far, we stumbled upon sports teams and hedge funds and the financial industry. I'm sure there are a lot more that have escaped our imagination, and that's fascinating.
Right. So tell me, while you're on this, why do you think no IPL team has contacted you to do exactly what? Because they also have this, they have finite inventory on ground or on jerseys and uniforms, but they have infinite inventory available to them on social.
Absolutely.
So why don't they do this? Why would you think?
I'm hoping they would. I mean, we just launched this product a few months ago.
Right.
So maybe it's efforts from our end that need to be done as well to make that happen.
Right.
I also think it's an evolution beyond the teams soliciting the big name, big ticket sponsors, because there seem to be enough of those to go around.
Right.
In some markets, people have gone beyond that to local sponsors. So if you're a Chennai-based local brand, if you're a sari brand in Chennai, you don't necessarily want to target all of India.
Right.
And Chennai Super Kings has the audience you're looking at.
Right. Sure.
So that mentality of thinking about local sponsors who would give you a lower amount of sponsorship, but the numbers add up.
And it becomes relevant reach as opposed to a lot of wastage.
Absolutely. For the brand, it's hugely relevant reach, right?
Yeah, so now come down to brass tacks, the most important question, which is you've had to, in the early days, almost talk to CEOs to get business. Then it settled down at the CMO, CXO level. So what is the change in the conversation that you have today compared to 8 years ago? That's the 8-year journey. Pitch has not been the same. I mean, you were monopolistic almost. Now you're in a competitive environment. So how does your pitch change?
It has changed.
So what are the conversations you have with the CMOs?
So earlier, our pitch used to be we're the social media benchmarking company for brands.
Right.
And the pitch was quite simple. On television, you benchmark your GRPs versus what competition is doing. You should be doing exactly the same thing on social. Here's an easy way to do it.
Right.
The pitch was one of efficiency. 5 minutes on the platform tells you what 5 people need 5 days to do, and we'll give it to you like nobody else can.
Right.
And automation and everything. That is still a use case, but the conversation has evolved beyond that to, right now the pitch is a lot more about content intelligence. So brands today are communicating at the speed of culture. Right? You remember the time when the brand would go away, brainstorm for a few days, come up with this huge, big idea that would have a shelf life of 6 months. So it used to be one campaign every 6 months. And today that brand is doing 6 campaigns a month. So that's an order of magnitude jump of about 36 times, which is a lot more content coming out from brands. And therefore, the requirement to ensure that the content you're putting is something truly original, something truly different, something that has not exactly been done some time back. Because that whole canvas for new ideas is rapidly shrinking every day. Right? An idea you have today could be executed by you or some other brand in the future, and therefore that's an idea that either you've got to morph on or you can't do anymore. And I think that's an interesting, that's part of our pitch right now, which is that we are a content intelligence company, a branded content intelligence company, that tells you everything about branded content that every major brand on the planet has put over the last 8 years.
Right.
It's like an old man moss of branded content. And that's valuable to brands.
Now, it's free to brands at the moment, the basic product, and yet you haven't had very many people picking it up. Why is that?
I think we had some figuring out to do in terms of onboarding and how people experience it, because the interesting thing was when we showed Discover to anybody, they loved it.
Right.
So when you had the luxury of a face-to-face conversation, a pitch, and saying, this is what we've got, people would look at it and say, wow, where were you all this time? But it's a bit of a different experience when it's a self-service experience, right? It's like a la carte and a buffet experience. You need people to go discover what's out there, pun intended. So we are trying to get that aha moment in terms of people finding something that makes them go wow, which is easy to do in a face-to-face conversation, replicate exactly that on an online onboarding. And we also learned a lot from those early users in terms of things they were looking at, because yes, they wanted to search for historical content, but they also wanted to see things like image tonality. Are they operating in this part of the color palette, or are they in blues and reds? Because I want to know what kind of content I should put if I'm a food and beverage brand in the Middle East around the time of Ramadan. And for that, I want to know what the typical color palette is around communication on that theme. Do people use dogs or babies or mountains in the imagery that they have? So we recently added a whole layer of intelligence around image detection and color detection and everything. And we're kind of relaunching the whole thing. We had a few beta tests and it's going pretty well. So I'm still optimistic about its self-service potential amplifying in 2019.
Okay. So I'm going to end this conversation with a conversation about India. You saw the interview that we did with Anant Mahindra. So what did the sense you get out of that interview?
The big thing for me was transparency. I mean, the man is, I've been a fan of Mr. Mahindra in terms of what he puts out on Twitter, the kind of conversations he has, the way he reacts to somebody, notwithstanding how big that person's following is or whether the person is an influencer or a publicly known figure. And there is a certain amount of transparency, honesty that comes through, which he's earned over the years. And that was entirely echoed in the interview as well, right? Which I found pretty beautiful. In terms of how he shared what they're doing, how he gave the example of when there were issues in various plants, how he knew it well before the people on the ground did, and how for him, Twitter and everything is not just about communicating and putting the human face of the brand, it's also about getting intelligence on everything happening on geographically distant parts of his companies. It was fascinating.
Okay, so what can brands learn from what Anant Mahindra does? Suppose it was not Anant. Imagine if Burger King could stare at Anant Mahindra and learn, what would Burger King do differently or extra?
It's funny you mention Burger King.
Right.
Because, you always went with this thing of markets are conversations and brands should be like humans, and then brands started putting a bit of humor. But brands would always stay clear of a few things, taboo topics like politics and things that can be polarizing. And humans wouldn't. People would talk about things that can polarize. Anant Mahindra doesn't always do it, but he does talk about things that are close to his heart, puts his opinions out there. Brands don't, because you can alienate a big segment of a paying population over there. And that's something I think brands can learn and are learning, because in the last 1 year, at least in a lot of markets, you've seen brands taking very, very polarizing stances. Burger King, coming back to the example, when Trump talked about hamburgers with the typo recently, they put a joke around that, which was laughed at by a lot of people, but also some people took offense.
Absolutely.
And that is a conscious stance.
Right.
When Nike decided to talk about Colin Kaepernick, I mean, suddenly they alienated a whole segment of their people who went around burning sneakers. But that is truly a human brand.
Which wasn't a bad thing, but they burnt Nike sneakers.
I mean, it dies down, they had to buy new sneakers.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
I think brands actually being more human, it might be rooted in market research and seeing how much of audience you're going to gain and lose. But that is yet to come. We still haven't seen brands truly putting themselves out there. They're still taking safe routes and being very safe in terms of what they talk about and don't talk about. And I think that's the next phase of the evolution in terms of markets truly being conversations, brands truly being human, and that will be interesting to see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laks.
Thank you, Anand.
And see you soon.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that was Lakshmanan Narayan in conversation with Anant Rangaswami. Anand, that was a very interesting conversation, especially the part when he says that brands need to use social media to develop a human quality. I think that's very interesting. Do you think consumers are attracted to stories more than products?
Well, you talk to traditional creative directors and they will tell you, it's Josie Paul told us, it's context, not content. So social media is, everything is about context. There's nothing else, there's no content really. It's about context. So when a brand is in focus as far as the consumer is concerned, for whatever reason, good reason, bad reason, there's a context which is set up and then the conversation will emanate from that. And well, you need to be in on the conversation, as simple as that.
But at the end of the day, he did mention that it all boils down to content and original content, no matter what platform you are on, right?
Yeah, but it's again content in a context. It's not content in absolutism. So it's the context that works.
So what do you think marketers can take away from this conversation?
Well, I think it'll help them navigate their social media efforts a little better. That's all it is. There's not rocket science. What Unmetric does is only distill all these conversations and present them to brand managers in a manner that he and she can understand.
Right. So on that note, let's have a look at this week's Melt cheat sheet. That's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can also watch all our content on our social media platforms. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.